Welcome to another episode of Friends in Wonder. Joe, I'm really excited about this week's episode because I learned a lot from our guest. He really broke down a deep and complex topic.
Yeah, me too, Vince. You know, to take such an ancient tradition like yoga and break it down the way we did with our sense of wonder and awe was a lot of fun. So let's get right into it. But remember, if you like this episode, please share it with a friend or leave some feedback at friendsinwonder.com.
Joe? Hey, Joe.
Hey, Vince.
What are you doing over there?
I'm just getting myself ready because we're talking about yoga today.
Yeah, we're talking about yoga today. I've walked in on you a few times, and I don't think I've ever walked in on you. What was that you're doing? You were doing?
So that is an Om, Vince, and it's a way whenever I go to my yoga studio and we do a class, we start with Oms, and then we actually do kind of a prayer or a salutation to Patanjali, and it's a way to kind of bring your mind into the space of what you're about to do, and
Oms and Patanjalis, you know.
Right.
So it's interesting. This is going to be a great show. I'm really excited about it because we've got a very talented and learned yoga instructor with us who we'll introduce later on. But we've both had some experiences in yoga in our life, and I know you're actively practicing two times a week now, or.
Well, yeah, I mean, I go to a private session a lot of times with my wife, Sonia. Try to do it twice a week. Then there's the private practice too of doing it at home. And, but yeah, I'm more actively involved in yoga, but it's only been, Vince, in the last 4 years. Here I am 62 years old, and I started at age 58. And I think part of the reason we wanted to do this episode is because I was a classic, example of somebody who thought yoga is not for me. And I know you had a similar kind of experience later in your life.
Yeah, I did. I remember we were talking about this beforehand, that in my 20s, and I would see when I'd go to some health clubs and gyms and places where yoga classes were offered, the vernacular, the words, the names of the positions. I really was a little bit intimidated because I thought I needed a lot of knowledge pre-learned before I could even go in there. And
exactly.
Yeah. And I was a little intimidated. I was like, oh boy, but over time, I did get involved with yoga. The place I got involved with it was at work at the newspaper in Detroit, and they had a yoga instructor come in, and they had a class of people that gathered of all ages, sizes, abilities. There was a person with a walker, and the instructor was so adept at outlining it that I actually started taking some yoga classes. And for many, many years, I did a practice with classes. And now, although I don't do classes, I still do my own little, I think it's a practice, but and maybe our guest can enlighten us about what an actual practice is. But throughout the week, I will have various sessions. Sheila used to do it with me until she was behind me one day and I did a downward dog pose, and she said that she could never get that picture out of her head. So she's done some classes herself, and but she practices in our basement now. So that's been my experience. I'm really glad I didn't ignore it all my life because I found it to be very valuable, and I know you have as well.
Yeah. And and I think part of what we want to break down today, and maybe not beat it too hard before we get to our guests, but is the idea of the misconceptions that people have. And certainly it sounds like you had misconceptions. I did too. I was intimidated because a couple of times I went to yoga classes in my 30s and 40s, and probably only 2 or 3 times. And typically, the class that I would end up in, there were, very thin women and very flexible. And, that along with the pictures you would see whenever whenever you see a yoga picture, it's somebody who's in top physical shape, striking the perfect pose. And I look at it and I go, whoa, I can't do that. And so in my mind, I thought you needed to be nimble. You needed to be physically fit. And I was really none of those things. I was reasonably fit and I could go to a gym and do things, but, I had very tight hamstrings my whole life and all sorts of things where I could barely touch my knees, let alone my toes. And so when I went to these classes, I kind of felt like I was the oddball there and everybody else was doing, was light years ahead of me. And so I never really felt quite welcome with it until I met our guest. And then, even though he's extremely advanced, he's very advanced with teaching beginners like me. So I think that maybe that's a good time to bring our guest in.
Yeah. Well, I've looked on his website. I know you know him personally, but it'd be my pleasure and honor to read a little bit of his bio. We are going to be talking with Chris Briney, and I hope I pronounced that correctly. He is the owner and director of the Chris Briney Center for Iyengar Yoga, and I hope I pronounced that as well correctly. He's the director of the Center for Iyengar Yoga in Royal Oak, Michigan. He's one of only a small handful of teachers in Metro Detroit to attain certification as an Iyengar yoga teacher by the Iyengar National Association of the United States. He's also one of only 7 yoga teachers in the state of Michigan to attain an intermediate level 3 certification, and the only male yoga teacher in the state to do so. Certification as an Iyengar yoga instructor is widely regarded as the highest standard of certification for teachers of Hatha yoga worldwide. So I'd like to welcome you, Chris. I hope I didn't do dance on the pronunciations too badly.
No, it was just fine. Thank you.
There's a one point of clarification. His yoga center, his studio is the Center for Iyengar Yoga in Royal Oak. I don't think Chris's name is attached to the Center for Iyengar Yoga.
Just my reputation.
Well, yeah. Anybody goes to that studio, they know Chris. That's for sure. Because Chris is always there, it seems. Isn't it true, Chris?
Quite often, yes. Yes.
Well, welcome to Friends in Wonder, Chris.
I wanted to start off, Chris. So first of all, I think maybe, I don't know if you heard all of our introduction, but we want to talk a little bit about some of the misconceptions of yoga. But before we do that, we wanted to really maybe go over with you, because I know from having been in your classes the last, several years, I know you have a pretty good knowledge of some of the history of yoga. And I thought the best place to start is in a few words. I know there's lots of books written on it, but what would you say yoga is, Chris?
Yeah, I thought you might throw one of those at the beginning.
A little curveball. It's like asking, what is love?
Like, what is the sky? I'll just give you, really what comes to me now, and then maybe circle back to definitions that resonate. But at least to understand the word yoga, it comes from the root word yuj, Y-U-J, which means to join, to attach, to yoke together. So it's really a process of bringing the various aspects of a human being together in a meaningful way, I would say, and where they're actually functioning for a similar purpose. So like the body, the mind, the intellect are linked, yoked up for the purpose of movement in some direction. A definition that I really resonate with, and I would say am consistently challenged by actually comes from my teacher, BKS Iyengar. So good job, Vince, with the pronunciation.
Thank you.
He says it's basically also that the word yoga, yuj, means to direct or concentrate one's attention on. And it means a union or communion. And he goes on to say it means it's the true union of our will with the will of God, with the divine will. That's like I know my will, but the will of God, I don't know. So that the process of seeking to yoke myself, the yoke like two oxen where when they're pulling a plow, can I hook myself to that? I guess in my view, my understanding of divinity, which I don't know anyone that can really claim that, but would be to love, goodwill, goodness, health on a lot of different levels. So to me, I think it's good to start there.
That's excellent. I think that's excellent because I think really that's part of what makes yoga so different from, a lot of people, because, and again, we don't want to dwell on misconceptions of yoga to mean that yoga is in some way misconceived, because it's not. It's really well understood now, but there's still a lot of people out there that think of yoga as a form of exercise or a form of stretching or that kind of thing, and it's so much more. And I think that's you did a great job of explaining that. In fact, that kind of segues into the next part that I wanted to talk to you about. And we may jump on this stuff kind of quickly, because obviously we could talk about this kind of stuff for hours. But what our goal is to kind of give a brief overview of the history and give people a better understanding of how yoga transcends really written history and goes back a long way. And the Patanjali doing the Yoga Sutras. Give us a little bit of background of that, because from what I understand, it's a little bit like the stories of Homer, that there were all these various people that had written ideas of Homer, and then somebody brought it all together and turned it into a cohesive book. And from what I understand, the Yoga Sutras is very similar in that Patanjali was really the sage that brought the historical use of yoga into a more unified idea.
Yeah, I think that's a good.
And how
metaphor.
far back? How far back does what he did go? If you know.
Well, okay, so I can't claim any exhaustive authority as a historian, but at least in my own studies, I've heard estimates that there are teachings on yoga that go back like 30,000 years.
Isn't that something? Wow.
And at least this much I understand. Patanjali was some even say, and again, I don't know the accuracy, but Patanjali was sort of like Shakespeare, where it was like, was it one person? Was it several people? But there are a few treatises that are attributed to Patanjali, and the chant you mentioned, or the invocation that you mentioned we do in class, acknowledges Patanjali as having done really three things. He wrote a treatise, or compiled a treatise on yoga, which the chant we do says was given for serenity of the mind, which is an interesting, just going back to that question. Also wrote a treatise on grammar for clarity of expression, clarity and purity of expression, and a treatise on Ayurveda, which is one of the oldest forms of natural medicine, perhaps the oldest, we don't know, but for health of the body. So those are three fundamental human interests that Patanjali impacted. So who Patanjali was, there's some iconography where he was half human and half snake, and history.
Yeah, those statues or whatever. Yeah, those
right,
images.
Like he lived somewhere in the cosmos with Vishnu, who's one of the main deities in Hinduism.
So a godlike kind of figure, but somebody who lived and walked among us.
Who incarnated.
Yeah.
To learn yoga, to impart yoga. So it is said, I've heard it said that in Patanjali's time, there were, I don't remember the exact number, but hundreds or thousands of different schools or disciplines of yoga, which is kind of interesting because we're finding a lot of branches and disciplines of yoga today. Some are quite profound, some are comical in some ways, but like I just heard about, they call it bend and burn, it involves like marijuana and yoga.
Okay, that makes sense.
And so there, at Patanjali's time, I don't know if such a thing was happening, but there was lots of specialization. It's been compared to like modern medicine, where you don't just have a hip person, you might have a labrum person now, or not a certain type of eye doctor or throat doctor. There's the specialization. So what Patanjali was known for was taking that whole big, vast, somewhat branching out discipline of yoga and really coalescing it into its essence.
And again, it was thousands of years ago, at least. Yeah.
It's estimated around 2,500 years ago, sometime 250 to 500 BC.
Yeah.
That it was published. So,
well, that's good. So, and then, kind of fast forwarding, we don't need to get into the full history, but then fast forwarding, the real, like, it's similar to rock and roll, where we had the British invasion. Yoga kind of invaded America as well, in roughly around the same time, right? Was it the 60s or the 50s?
It seems, from what I can tell, well, I wasn't there in the 60s, unfortunately, but.
Well, I was there. We were there, but we were young. We were riding our bikes back then.
You're right. Okay.
Not thinking about yoga.
You weren't tuning in or tuning out and dropping out, or however.
No, exactly. Not yet. We waited till our teens for that.
Okay. There was something about like the World's Fair in 1900 where a Swami Vivekananda came, and that seemed to spark a little push. Paramahansa Yogananda came. I believe it was a little before the 60s, but in terms of at least the yoga I study, Iyengar started to gain some exposure to the Western world around the mid 60s to early 70s. And actually in the Metro Detroit area, Ann Arbor was one of the first sort of Iyengar yoga meccas it was the place. His first American students, I believe, or students from the US came from Ann Arbor, and that was early 70s.
Yeah. So,
yeah.
Well, that's interesting.
I think one other thing I would say, in my own experience, it really took off. Yoga really took off in the early 2000s here in the US. When I started in 1997, there was pretty much one yoga studio in the Metro Detroit area. There may have been two, other things where it taught at a Y or a church gymnasium, but a yoga studio, no. But now in our area or any metro area, I mean, you've got dozens and dozens of yoga studios. So that started, I would say, early 2000s. It really blew up in that way. But yeah.
Chris, let's talk. We wanted to talk a little bit about misconceptions, and I think this is a good opportunity to talk a little bit about our personal relationship. I came to you about 4 or 5 years ago. Well, how long ago? When did you open your studio? Because I know I was there when you started it.
That's right. Yeah, I delayed you for a little bit because I was in the midst of the construction.
Yeah, exactly.
So we opened in June of 2018.
Okay, so it's been for about 4 years. And when I came to you, I'm a classic, kind of 62-year-old male who did exercise his own way. And I had a number of injuries over the years. And I was very, very apprehensive, to say the least. I don't know if you remember that, but I was
Mhm.
quite certain that I was an unteachable candidate of yoga, and you kind of just smiled and began. I don't know that I was a piece of clay. I might have been more a piece of brick at the time. But is there anybody who you can't teach?
Um, yeah, I mean, I think there are. I do. I think there may be. It's sort of on two ends of the spectrum. There are people that. I mean, I believe I have students, and just honestly, Joe, there are things I know about you that, as far as yoga is concerned, what I consider yoga, you are in some ways more advanced than I am as an evolved conscious being. Just honestly, even though I may have a physical ability that would exceed yours, I can put my hands on the floor, or I can get my leg behind my head on most days, and I can go up into handstand. But you mentioned about misconception. Well, first, let me answer the question about who I can't teach. I would say, there are people who are pretty tapped in to their divine essence, and I feel, for me as a teacher and practitioner, that's an area I'm growing. I had plenty of physical ability coming to yoga, and I've really come to see it as something more. But in terms of physical condition, I feel I could teach just about anybody.
Well, I guess that's kind of there was a backdoor way of getting to the point I was hoping, and that is that, if you're injured, if you're a beginner, if you're very old, if you're recovering from a surgery, if you're pregnant, if you have a prosthetic, like, it doesn't matter, right? I mean, especially because it isn't just physical.
Yeah. If there's a willingness, to be patient, because some things need to be figured out. Just like, I mean, I actually haven't taught someone with a prosthetic, but I have had a couple of students who may have a birth defect, or, where that severely affects a limb, or the two limbs aren't the same.
And that's interesting.
Yeah, in terms of,
I don't mean to cut you off, but that's interesting, because one of the things I don't think we've explained yet is what makes Iyengar yoga different from other yoga practices. And that is at least in the physical part of it, is their use of, the tools and the different aids within yoga. So it isn't just person in mat, it could be person in strap, or person with the bolster, or with a chair, or with ropes hanging from a wall, and that kind of thing. Get into that a little bit about what sets Iyengar yoga apart maybe from other forms.
Yeah, well, I mean, I can't speak too authoritatively on many forms. I've mostly done Iyengar yoga, but I know what we've seen as characteristics of the method. One is the technicalities, where you're certainly if you're putting forces through the body. So the word hatha itself, one translation is force. And when you bend, or when you twist, or, I mean, right now, 24/7, gravity is a force acting upon us. And any movement you make with your body, or position you take, there will be forces on the tissues, skin, muscles, bones, joints. So the technicalities, on the one hand, assure that those forces are being applied safely, but also effectively. And so the technicalities, I think, are a place where the philosophy enters.
Yeah.
Like the balance between effort and surrender, the balance between strong determination and a sense of yielding and openness. So that's one aspect, technicalities. Another is how things are put together. So sequencing.
Oh, yeah.
I know the Iyengar method has a lot of distinct principles about sequencing. And as teachers, we're challenged to give a lot of thought to how do things go together for cumulative effects. Just like a piece of music, or a meal, or even medications, how do they interact to produce the optimal result?
Right.
So technicalities, sequencing, timings, how long we hold the postures, because that allows a certain process to unfold. I think those are often noted as features. And you mentioned about equipment. The equipment really lends to all of the aspects, but certainly helps with technicalities. Like some people can't reach the floor in a certain pose. So we bring a block, we bring the floor to them.
Yeah.
They might help with timings and even sequence. So
Yeah.
those are some features. Yeah.
Yeah, and for me, that was really what brought it into my grasp, because I can't touch my toes, and a block was even somewhat out of reach. You brought a chair to me, or whatever, and then from there, I could kind of relax into the idea of the pose. Maybe not the way it was drawn up, or maybe not the way you have pictures on the wall of BKS Iyengar doing it, but
none of us do that really. Not many mortals do,
but it, in the various aids and equipment and tool, just take a lot of the intimidation out of it, and makes it more accessible, I think. But go ahead, Vince.
Well, I was just going to say, we talked a little bit about, age and physicality, and on sort of the older age range. Is it ever too young to get someone involved in yoga? So I'm thinking of children. How can one best bring them into the fold, so to speak, or,
and when
the barriers? Yeah. And when?
Yeah. Very good. Though, I'm glad you're mentioning that. And I want to circle back really quickly. Nobody is too old, too stiff, too fat, too thin. It's really a matter of teachability and sensitivity. I think you don't have to you don't have to be super bendy to be sensitive, and to and sometimes the stiffer folks, they develop more equanimity because of the intensity of their experience than the flexible ones. They're actually interacting with the life process more profoundly, which is in many ways the essence of yoga. Mm-hmm. So for children, at least mostly when I'm in doubt, I feel the Iyengar family has, just knowing their story and history, they've lived, breathed, eaten, slept yoga. It's been a passion. More, I don't even know how I would describe it, but they've have a lot of experience and have taught a lot. And I think it's pretty wise that they say below the age of 8 for children, if they want to play, let them play. But there's really you don't enforce any kind of regimen or discipline. There's no technicalities, no sequence, no timings. They play. And one thing they're emphatic about is nothing is ever forced, because a child's body is developing. Certain neurology isn't formed. Even their bones and joints aren't fully formed. So there's no insistence upon, you let their wisdom guide it. And it's very interesting. I've worked with children a bit, and if anything is unsafe or injurious, they just come right out. They don't go there. Their body intelligence is that way. So they're often very limited risk. But then after 8, you can start to introduce a little more guidance. And it seems to me by maybe, it depends on the child, but teens, you can start to work more formalized practice with a little more rigor. But for the most part, it's move a lot, do a lot, don't fuss about the details. That comes later when our bodies are slower and our heads are full of a lot more stuff.
Yeah. And it's not just the physicality of it too. It's the spiritual development that probably takes time in the same way. For instance, an 8-year-old may not have a wealth of life experiences to look back on and join up in that definition of yoga, right? I mean, it might take some time for that.
Well, I think that's a good point. They have a lot less baggage to work through. Right. There's a much purer connection to being, it seems. And for us, that's often covered over and layered over, which is part of what we're breaking up as we break up stiffness and patterns in the body, same thing in the consciousnse, ideally.
And segueing on that question that from Vince, it's along the lines of this idea of misconceptions. I know I've spoken to people over the years who said, "Oh yeah, I went to a yoga class, and they were praying before we started, and that made me very uncomfortable, and I never came back." And I to be honest, when I first came to your class and we did the invocation, obviously we have our hands clasped, and it's very prayer like. But I guess I had already evolved a little bit in terms of my idea of what prayer is. It isn't only in a church or under the guidance of a religious practitioner. But speak to that, Chris, because I think that is one of the misconceptions that we wanted to help break down, if you will, this idea that yoga does not interfere with your religious beliefs.
Yeah, well, I think I want to honor where people come from in terms of there are people for whom it does honestly conflict with their religious beliefs. They have very powerful religious beliefs in a certain way, and to pay respect to a sage like Patanjali, although in my view, I don't, I'm not at that echelon where I could say like, okay, well, Patanjali is better than Jesus or Buddha, or, like,
right.
I think
there are no betters.
they would really enjoy each other's company, be like, wow, finally someone who really understands what I'm talking about.
Yeah, probably. Yeah.
So I think the way I've resolved it is if you get to like the essence, the principles underneath the formalities in some way, or if you get at the intent, then I think you wouldn't necessarily find a conflict.
Yeah.
And some aspects of yoga, there are said to be 8 limbs of yoga. It's called Ashtanga yoga that Patanjali laid out. These are the 8 facets of yoga. And the first 2 facets are pretty much universal truths in not just in religions, but in cultures. Like, be honest, don't harm each other, don't take what isn't yours, don't take more than you need, don't take advantage, cultivate a sense of contentment and gratitude, try to hold a pure perspective, be disciplined. I mean, these are things that, yeah,
kind of a codification of our moral compasses type thing,
yeah.
but bringing attention to it.
Yeah.
Again, we could talk for hours. One of the things though that we wanted to cover before we bring this to a close is again, we don't mean to put you on the spot, because here we are saying, well, how is yoga not a religion? It's a tough one. How about let's throw another one at you that's a tough one, and that is, there's comparing the kinds of exercise that's out there with the exercise portion of yoga. For me, I guess I want to speak to it because I had my whole life thought of exercise as raising my heartbeat, burning calories, building muscle, building endurance and that kind of thing. And there's a lot of different ways to do that, right? There's boot camp, there's Orange Theory, there's there's Pilates and all these various kinds of things. And I did those things and I built my muscles. But when I came to you and really, I think the breakthrough for you and I was doing the private classes, although in your full classes, there were breakthroughs as well, because I broke down my own misconception that I can't perform in a class. But for me, what I found fascinating is our journey began and continues, is that here I am getting older in life, but I'm actually finding things in my in my physicality that I maybe haven't had since I was 8 years old. So typically when we age, we say, well, I can't do that anymore. I just got to forget about being able to do that or do this. And now I'm doing things in my later years that I haven't been able to do in my younger years. So I'm setting you up with the answer here. But I guess what primarily do you think is the difference between going to the gym and as a form of exercise and yoga as a practice? And I could help give that answer myself, but I'd like to hear your take on it.
All right. Again, this is coming from I did a lot of those things in my youth. I played sports, I lifted weights, I was a track runner. I think anything we do to enhance our aliveness is valuable. And so there was a period where I would sort of confidently say, yoga is the best technology for well-being, period. Mm-hmm. And in some ways I do feel that because of its potential. Like, what's coming to me is, okay, if I'm a weightlifter, the weight is always going to be the weight. The bar is always going to be the bar. If I'm running, the surface I'm running on will be the surface. And my body's going to interact with those things in a certain way. With weights, you can change your weights and repetitions and things like that. But each and every pose can be modified or tailored every single day. There aren't really a fixed set of variables. The equipment you're working on or the surface you're running on. I mean, I guess your floor surface will be different, but you can modify the pose of the same name for a variety of conditions. And I think that's a unique feature of yoga, in that if I'm say my workout is I run 3 miles a day or something, generally I'm going to run on the same surface. My shoes are my shoes, my joints are my joints, but what's happening in the body is fairly consistent based on the interaction of those elements. I think in yoga, we have a lot more control of the inputs based on, well, do I stretch further today? Do I stretch less far? Do I use this prop? Do I use that prop? Do I work with this surface? Do I work with this sequence?
It's like every time you practice yoga, there's a different revelation is kind of what or maybe a potential for a different inner revelation.
Sort of, or nuances in the recipe. And I suppose with anything that would be true. But I think it's quite available. And again, I don't have it. Yoga's been my thing for years, but although I have done some running, but you can't really, if I'm running around a track or around my neighborhood or in the woods, there's a certain just fact that every step I have to take a certain way with a certain amount of force. I have a lot more control of, how I bend forward in a practice or how I bend backward in a practice. And just one other piece that I don't think you find in the other exercises are the inversions, which would be a whole other, topic in and of itself. But we do upside down work, and the effects on the body physiology, chemistry, neurology are, as well as your own, like perspective or spirit. How do you orient when your things are turned upside down? How do you find your bearings when your feet are taken out from under you? Things like that. That's another feature that is quite unique to yoga. Yeah. The inverted work. Yeah.
Well, and that was one of those things that when I saw it, I'm like, well, I'll never be doing that. And I certainly am. And I agree. And, I've thought about that over the years because I'm very interested in, this whole idea of how we've evolved and what genetically we were evolved to do. And certainly human beings were evolved to be climbing up in trees and probably hanging upside down, not unlike monkeys, still do today. So, the whole idea of inverting and getting the blood to flow in a different way and clear your lymphatic system and that kind of thing, from what I understand, is extremely beneficial physiologically. And I know I feel that, feel the benefits of that.
Well, so Chris, so just for the listener here who may have listened to all of this and said, okay, you guys did a deep dive into this, and I feel ready to start out, but I'm just not, quite sure, beginning, or somebody who says, oh, this all sounds intriguing. What would your recommendation be? And can you talk a little bit about doing it at home instead of in a studio?
Sure. Yeah. Great questions. Well, somebody who is beginning, I would emphasize that it is important to find a good teacher, a capable teacher, and how you determine that. The standards in yoga are fairly varied. So somebody can be what's called a registered yoga teacher, or have completed a teacher training, but not necessarily. There really isn't a kind of agreed upon, and I'm not saying there should be, standard for certification. So with certain programs, you could start. I could have yoga my first day. I go into a teacher training program, and 200 hours later, or 6 months later, or whatever it is, I'm a certified teacher. And they may be a great person. They may have a lot of knowledge. They may be a natural. That's something you could vet. So I think it's knowing what your objectives are, knowing what your condition is. If you have any health conditions, like Joe, you mentioned someone pregnant, you definitely should take care about what they do. Not all some poses you ought not do during pregnancy. You can compromise yourself. Some people are fine with it, but there are risks that you can avoid. So knowing what your condition is, knowing what your objectives are, and then do some research of your teacher. Find out what their knowledge is, and do you feel confident learning from them? Do you feel you'll be served well? That would be first. And this links to your question about a personal practice. I would say it's important to learn some things from a teacher initially. And it could be after your first class, or first, second, third class. You might have, oh, okay, we did these things, and just go do them for 5-10 minutes on your own a couple days before your next class. And then like that, it will slowly build. It will generally accrue over time. The more you learn, the more you'll start to build your practice, which does become an important piece that as much as we have all this technique in Iyengar yoga, they're emphatic that you have to learn. It's a self-taught practice as well. So you get information, but you really digest it, break it down in your own personal practice.
And I can speak to that because, I was as, I don't want to say reluctant. I came to you willingly, but I was as skeptical a student as there was. And part of what's interesting is, you feel a sense of security having the certified teacher in front of you showing you what to do, but there's also going on a little bit of self-consciousness, or a little bit of maybe pressure to do it the right way in front of the teacher. And what I find when I'm at home trying to do the same thing that you tried to show, or that you did show me, the day before, I'm like, because I'm able to explore without, any self-conscious thinking of what you're thinking or what other people in the class might be thinking, whatever. And when I'm by myself and exploring on my own, like you said, it's more meaningful. And as you begin to do more of that, that's where I think this whole idea, kind of segueing back to the beginning, this, your definition of yoga, the yoking or the bringing together of the physicality with the spirituality and the mind, and that's when I think it really becomes meaningful. And I can tell you, that I never would have dreamed 4 years later that I would be having profound experiences in my own private practice. I thought that was, at my stage in life, that was impossible.
And just, I want to circle back to you said at some point, just a little bit offhand, like you see all these people in these perfect postures, or there was some mention of a perfect posture.
Well, yeah. I mean, very rarely do you see yoga poses, being demonstrated where it's being done wrong by somebody who can't really, get his,
Well,
like
it depends on how trained the eye is, but really, I think this is an important point, though. I think the perfect yoga pose is the one that you're describing, Joe, where you really are having some sense of profundity of your experience and appreciation for the life that's in you, where you, there's a great quote from Iyengar. It's like, a real yoga pose is where the thought of Brahman, which is the, divinity, universal divinity, flows, I think he says, effortlessly and incessantly through the awareness of the practitioner. Beautiful. And that doesn't require any physical I mean, you don't have to, it's not like, oh, that happens when you touch your toes. That's a state that's always available. And you said, here you are, you never expected, you're 4 years older than when you started, but the profundity of your experience is increasing. I think that's really how the yoga ought to be measured.
Yeah.
Beautiful. Well, Chris, it's obvious that you have brought that type of connection to my co-host Joe and many other people, and we are grateful that you shared such a depth of experience with us today. Now, for people looking to find out more about Iyengar Yoga, you have a website. Where can they find you at online?
So for my studio, it's it's www.center for Iyengar, Iyengar yoga.com.
And then Chris, what would you say your favorite book on yoga is? Would it be Light on Yoga, I assume?
Boy, that's a good question.
Ooh, I shouldn't have thrown that one.
I would say,
how about for beginners? Light
on Yoga is great. There's also, it's a great manual for practice. It's also a great manual for an excellent distillation of the yoga philosophy. But another really beautiful book on I think some of the ideas we've explored here it's called Light on Life by B.K.S. Iyengar. And it's not a lot of technical information, but just a lot of wisdom, inspiration for how this practice can have us evolve.
That's beautiful. That's a great way to end it, I think.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for your time. Thanks for your time, Chris. We really appreciate it.
Well, thanks. It's been an honor, and I really appreciate what you're doing, just with the focus on wonder.
Yeah, well, that's what we're we have a wide range of topics, but it all comes down to the common theme of living, loving life, and how can you do better, and yoga certainly is a big part of that.
Thanks for including me in that. I'm honored to be with you both.
Wow, Joe, what a great interview. I am so ready to get back into the studio now after listening to Chris break that complex topic down so well.
Yeah, isn't he great? I'm very fortunate to have him as an instructor, and I think all the people in southeastern Michigan are lucky to have access to him too. So if you haven't been to his studio yet, I think you should come in and give it a try. Or if you're outside of this area, he also does online classes at centerforiyengaryoga.com.
Or find a local studio and instructor near you. There's plenty of them around, and it's good for the soul. Thanks again for listening to Friends in Wonder. We'll see you next time.